immediate resonance in the minds and lives of our youth still seeking opportunity to express and actualize themselves, our farmers working to feed nations, our Juakali entrepreneurs striving in pursuit of success in the informal economy, and our professionals who formulate policy, implement strategy, and monitor service delivery in public and private sectors. Africa places immense value in the international community and the tremendous possibilities it can unlock through inclusive, sustainable, and effective action to transform the lives of our people and establish lasting peace, security, and shared prosperity. This watershed moment is our chance to turn the key and open this door of opportunity. We can make progress in addressing the triple global threats and liberate ourselves from the shame of past failures of multilateralism. At this watershed moment, we must not only choose, but also act decisively to bequeath our children and their children a greener, safer, healthier, and more abundant earth. Let us do it together, inclusively, multilaterally. I thank you.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Kenya and Commander-in-Chief of the Defense Forces of the Republic of Kenya for his statement, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Ali Bongo Ondimba, President of the Gabonese Republic. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Ali Bongo Ondimba, President of the Gabonese Republic, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Mesdames,
Heads of State and Government, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I convey to you my congratulations on your election to the presidency of the 77th General Assembly of the United Nations, and I wish you every success. I greet and congratulate your predecessor, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, for the commitment which was patently clear throughout the 76th session. To the Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, I reiterate the full support of my country as he serves our organization. Mr. President, I am delighted to once again stand earnestly before this rostrum because the situation demands just that. Indeed, the international system is at a critical juncture. The world struggles to recover from a pandemic and sits in the clutches of a multidimensional crisis. The emergence of new centers of influence means that positions have become increasingly more entrenched. And this situation means that we must prioritize ongoing dialogue in order to find global consensus, rather than prioritizing power struggles as we tackle issues which are sensitive within the multilateral system. In the face of rivalry between powers and in the face of multifaceted challenges which are of shared concern, it would be dangerously naive to continue to opt for power struggles or for unilateral positions. The interconnected nature of global issues and of national economies means that we must engage in dialogue in order to respond appropriately and, above all, collectively to the most serious threats to international peace and security. We are in the last quarter of a year which has seen global challenges grow tougher. They have laid waste to common and individual efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. With less than 8 years to go until the deadline, it is crucial to evaluate our progress in light of a threat which the COVID-19 pandemic has meant continues to weigh heavy on our economies. A threat which is just as insidious now hovers over our economies. This threat is inflation. Throughout the world, inflation is reaching tragic highs. No one is spared, not businesses or households, not the North or the South. Its effects are devastating. As such, we must act, individually, of course. That is exactly what Gabon is doing by subsidizing certain commodities and by keeping their prices at certain levels. But here too, we will not successfully overcome this problem if we do not act collectively in a coordinated fashion and with a sense of solidarity. This is yet one more challenge issued to the world. We must together, all together, overcome it.
President, this year marks many new beginnings for Gabon as we arise from the tragedy and forced inertia of the coronavirus pandemic and reopen to the world. We are the newest member of the Commonwealth of Nations, home to 2.5 billion people, 1/3 of the world's population, with shared values of respect for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. My country is broadening horizons for our citizens and seizing the chance for our young people to benefit from studying, traveling, and building business relationships far beyond our own borders. At the same time, Gabon takes its place on the world stage, not alone, but as a proud African nation. But the problems that our world faces today are global, as are the solutions. We must all be outward-facing, not inward-looking, as we confront the difficulties of the world where resources are finite and the population growing. This month, our Commonwealth family has lost its leader, Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Through the union that she loved so deeply, the Queen offered respect, friendship, and wise counsel to many independent nations around the world, small or large. She promoted peace, liberty, and shared values, and fostered the spirit of cooperation. As the new head of the Commonwealth, His Majesty King Charles III can be assured of my full support as in that of the Gabonese people. A dear friend of Gabon for many years, King Charles III shares my enthusiasm for protecting our natural environment and biodiversity in the same ways for global climate and sustainability. Mr. President, 50 years after the Stockholm Conference, humanity faces an unprecedented triple environmental crisis: climate change, the biodiversity extinction crisis, and pollution, notably by plastics. Regarding climate, with 88 forests covered and deforestation well below 0.1%, Gabon is a high forest, low deforestation country par excellence. Since COP15 in Copenhagen, Gabon has net absorbed over 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide. We absorb over 100 million tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year. In other words, we have already achieved, indeed exceeded the Paris Agreement objective of carbon neutrality. We are counting on the creation of a net sequestration carbon market to enable us to maintain this performance through 2050 and beyond. Secondly, I found the biodiversity crisis extremely alarming. COP15 in Montreal will be a decisive moment for humanity, and it's critical that we adopt an ambitious global biodiversity framework. The time has come to transition from billions to trillions by mobilizing 1% of global GDP for nature. Finally, pollution has become a chronic problem in our cities, our rivers, our oceans. We must lose no time adopting a binding international agreement on plastic pollution, as well as a treaty on the high seas. In order to achieve sustainable development goals, our international agreements and national policies must address the interdependence of this crisis. Mr. President, threats to international peace and security continue to increase exponentially faced with the proliferation of the armed groups. Restricting our access to arms will be at the heart of my country's priorities during our presidency of the United Nations Security Council in October. In this regard, I would like to reiterate my country's call for a robust partnership to ensure greater security in the Gulf of Guinea. Many countries face humanitarian crises exacerbated by armed conflict. This is the case in Ukraine, where the war has led to a worsening of the situation of countries and regions already experiencing food shortages. This is why my country has clearly expressed its opposition not only to this bloody war, but to any form of war. Gabon, which has never experienced armed conflict, will continue to advocate and favor dialogue and negotiation over confrontation. Mr. President, access to education for children should be considered sacred. Therefore, I would like to express my country's resolute support for the sanctuarizations of schools on places of education, and particularly during armed conflicts. To compromise education is to place a mortgage on future generations. It is in this vein that I've made the promotion of women and young people a key priority. In 2015, I launched the Decade of the Gabonese Women, which aims to reserve a place of choice for women and children in all aspects of governance in Gabon. Mr. President, internationalism is at a turning point. We need to reform the United Nations to ensure better consideration of the aspirations of Africa. This is particularly applicable to the Security Council, where Africa's role needs to be consolidated. Africa has waited long enough, and we will not wait any longer. In light of the strong interdependence of nations, It is crucial that we put an end to the use of sanctions, working instead to build bridges of prosperity. As such, I call once again for the total lifting of the embargo that has affected the government and the people of Cuba for several decades. Inevitably, the principal victims of any embargo are the weak and the vulnerable. In the Middle East, Gabon has always believed that a two-state solution is the only way to achieve peace and security. It is the responsibility of our generation to resolve this problem. To conclude, Mr. President, I would like to reiterate Gabon's attachment to the principles and values of solidarity at the heart of the United Nations Charter. To this end, I reiterate my country's solemn appeal to all members of the international community to live up to our shared commitments in order to ensure peace, security, and dignity for the peoples of the world. I thank you.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale,
On behalf of the General Assembly, I would like to thank the President of Gabon for his statement, and I ask protocol to please accompany His Excellency.
l'Assemblée va maintenant
The Assembly will now hear a statement from His Excellency Mohamed Ifran Ali, President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. I would ask protocol to please escort His Excellency to the podium.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale,
On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor of welcoming His Excellency Mohamed Irfan Ali, President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, I extend my heartfelt congratulations on your election as President of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I'm confident that your stewardship will lend further credence to the impactful role of multilateralism in resolving global challenges. I thank your predecessor, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, for his shrewd leadership over the past year. I had the distinct privilege of welcoming him recently to Guyana and benefiting from his experience in championing an inclusive future for our youth. Congratulations to him, the Secretary General, and the General Assembly for the recently passed resolution on the establishment of a United Nations Youth Office. 1 month ago in Guyana, I launched the Youth Advisory Council as part of my government's commitment to ensure the involvement of young people in decision-making and development as the government work towards building Guyana's future. We are living in a troubled world which has lost its balance. Indeed, our collective actions as leaders today will convey to the next generation that their aspirations, their future, and that of the planet are worth fighting for. The international community is facing a series of interlocking challenges: a global pandemic, climate challenges, energy and food crisis, and interstate conflicts. As a consequence of the pandemic, approximately 97 million more persons are living on less than $1.90 per day, significantly increasing the global poverty rate and inequalities. The developing world lost revenues and income that were earmarked for the achievement of many sustainable development goals, pushing us further away from our 2030 targets. A UN report in March 2022 spoke definitively to the unequal distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and its impact on widening economic disparity between the rich and the poor. The study found that low-income countries could have increased their GDP by $16.7 billion in 2021 if they had a similar vaccination rate as high-income developed countries. How are we going to address this inequality? How are we going to address this injustice? Guyana's position is that there must be an immediate re-examination of the financing gap and the debt portfolio of the developing countries to open fiscal space and create an opportunity for recovery, bridging the gap, and attaining the SDG goals. Guyana welcomes the global initiatives around pandemic preparedness. It is imperative that we collectively discuss how to address any potential pandemic and health threats so that we are better equipped in the future to avoid the inequalities that exist. Mr. President, Excellencies, the global food security problem has disproportionately affected us. The prevalence of moderate and severe food insecurity trended upwards since 2014, with estimated increase in 2020 equaling that of the previous 5 years combined. In 2020, 2.37 billion of the world's population were food insecure. Additionally, the World Food Programme and FAO warned that acute food insecurity would worsen in 20 hunger hotspots from June to September 2022. Since the start of the pandemic, global food prices have surged by 65% and are expected to remain high in the medium term as a result of supply chain constraints, a hike in energy costs, higher shipping costs, climate issues, the war in Ukraine, and the fertilizer crisis. Further, since the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war, global food prices increased sharply, reaching an all-time high in February 2022. The FAO projects that the production of cereals, a crop relied on the most in the world, would decline by 40 million tons, or 1.4% when compared to the preceding year. The global food import bill trajectory is a whopping 1.8 trillion this year, a record high. The global food import bill is projected to rise by 51 billion from 2021, 49 billion of which reflects higher prices. The question is, what are we going to do about this? Can the reversal of export bans on rice and wheat and freeing up of grains help the situation? The answer is a resounding yes. For example, export bans of rice from India and wheat from Russia contributed to a price increase of 12.3% and 9% for rice and wheat respectively. As world leaders, we must find the balance now. In honoring our commitment to promote peace, stability, respect for territorial integrity and democracy, and the human rights for all, we must work collectively to prevent situations that can widen inequality and create social and economic havoc. Now is the time for us to decide if a new approach is needed to guarantee food security, energy security, climate security, access to health care and quality education, and security from conflicts and wars. According to the World Bank and Global Trade, between January to February 2022, 135 policy measures were announced or implemented that affected trade in food and fertilizer. During the same period, 34 nations imposed restrictive export measures on food and fertilizers. The questions therefore are whether globalization is only applicable under normal conditions, or whether it is opportunistic and in its application, and when a crisis arises, we lock ourselves in and forget about multilateralism and globalization. The evidence is glaring. COVID-19 vaccination and now access to food and fertilizer. A welcome initiative is the FAO's Global Food Import Financing Facility, which seeks to respond to the prevailing soaring food import costs and addressing the needs of the most exposed. However, there is need to revise the eligibility criteria to accommodate countries beyond the categories of low-income and low-middle-income groups. This narrow grouping heightens the chance that many at-risk, economically vulnerable countries, such as the Caribbean, with large food and food import needs, will be excluded. Mr. President, Excellencies, we all recognize that there is a climate crisis. We must go back to some of the decisions. For example, in COP26, we agreed no more coal-fired power projects. What is the reality? While policies and planning for climate change adaptation are expanding, according to the Adaptation Gap Report 2021, the Gathering Storm, financing and implementation are still far behind. Financing of adaptation and implementation are still far behind where they should be. The analysis shows the costs of adaptation are most likely to be higher than the predicted range of US 140 to 300 billion annually by 2030, and US dollars 280 to 500 billion annually by 2050 for developing nations. In 2019, US dollars 79.6 billion was allocated to developing nations for planning and carrying out mitigation and adaptation measures. The gap between predicted adaptation costs and existing public adaptation financial flows is generally growing and ranges from 5 to 10 times more. The paltry 100 billion pledge and the failure to meet it must be viewed in the context of the likely costs of climate change, climate action for mitigation, adaptation, and addressing loss and damage. It is not enough. The adoption of broad rules on carbon markets in Glasgow has the potential to unlock critical resources for forest-rich countries. Forested countries like Guyana can potentially earn billions of dollars accessible through the voluntary carbon markets. However, the current approximate price is US $10 per ton on the voluntary market, whilst according to an IMF report, the price should be closer to $70 per ton. COP27 must make progress in refining the rules for the implementation of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and make decisions that would increase the price of carbon traded in voluntary carbon markets. Mr. President, Excellencies, the world is also faced with an energy crisis. In 2019, almost 10% of the world's population did not have access to electricity. Electricity generated by fossil fuel increased by 178% from 2000 and 2021. Electricity generated from coal increased by 173% from 2000. Based on a recent energy outlook from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, coal-fired generation is expected to be a key energy component as a result of several factors, including a drop in the share of natural gas and rising oil prices. Whilst all of this is occurring, the global energy demand is projected to increase by 47% in the next 30 years. According to the IEA, global electricity demand grew by 6% in 2021 and is projected to grow by 2.4% in 2022, of which only 50% is expected to be met from renewables. As such, the other 50% would have to be met from non-renewable energy sources. Furthermore, analysis by the IEA indicates that getting on the path to net zero emissions by 2050 would require a threefold increase in the current level of investments in the clean energy transition to about $4 trillion by 2030. The question is, therefore, how do we realistically strike this balance? This conversation must be practical, comprehensive, and fact-based. We all recognize that adjustments must be made to save our planet. But how will we craft this adjustment, considering the energy and food crisis, which are also critical, and ensure that inequality and access do not widen? In this energy transition, fossil fuel remains necessary. In this context, we are convinced that new entrants like Guyana must be part of this balanced approach. Even as a new entrant, Guyana proposed at COP26 the removal of subsidies from fossil fuel production and advocated the need for a strong global carbon price. We, however, do not believe that new entrants should be punished by removing access to financing and increasing costs of financing. This, in effect, will protect an existing monopoly, drive up the cost of investment, and deliver a higher price product. Mr. President, Excellencies, we are committed to building a Guyana that addresses issues of food security, climate change, energy security, and inequalities within our country and the region. Under the banner of One Guyana, my government has embarked on many initiatives to help bridge the gaps of inequality and access. We are on a path to reduce Guyana's food import bill and increase food security through increased cultivation and investment in new technology, climate-smart agriculture, all aimed at positioning Guyana as a leading food producer in CARICOM. Providing incentives, capital, land, and opportunities for youth and women to participate in agricultural transformation. To this end, you've earmarked 35% of all new agro-businesses to be led by women and have increased youth participation in agriculture with the use of technology by more than 40%. We are pursuing a low-carbon development strategy, which aims at creating a model for value ecosystem services and sustainably developing and managing the blue economy, investing in clean energy and stimulate low-carbon growth, protecting against climate change and biodiversity loss, alignment with global climate and biodiversity goals. Our forests, which is the size of England, stored 19.5 gigatons of carbon with a deforestation rate of less than 0.05%. We intend to continue the sustainable management of our forests as a key national and global good. Having already achieved net zero, we are working steadfastly in our transition from a 2020 status of 95% dependence on heavy fuel oil and diesel to an energy mix which includes hydropower, solar, wind, and natural gas, from which more than 500 megawatts of new generating capacity will come on stream, of which 87% of this generated energy will be from clean and renewable sources. Human resource transformation through education is a key driver of our development. The achievement of inclusive and equitable quality education and promotion of lifelong learning opportunities are all inextricably linked to attaining our sustainable development goals, including full employment, poverty eradication, and gender equality. Access to free, quality primary and secondary education will soon be followed by free tertiary education. The government of Guyana has invested in our indigenous communities in infrastructure, education, training, healthcare, and installing internet access capabilities. And we have commenced the training of our workforce for 2030 and beyond. Soon, we will be offering coding skills at our primary school, primary and secondary levels. Mr. President, Excellencies, gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in all spheres of life, of national life, is a priority. We are committed to ensuring equal access to education for girls and boys. Indeed, more girls are attending school in Guyana and graduating from university. Our focus now includes ensuring that our boys are not left behind. We have initiated several programs to create earning and employment opportunities for women and promote their financial independence, recognizing that empowerment is inextricably linked to addressing the root causes of and eradicating discrimination and gender-based violence. To achieve balanced growth and sustainable and resilient development for Guyana, our strategies must focus on developing a diversified economic base, strengthen our agricultural and food production system, human resource transformation, investing in the social sector to deliver world-class health, education, and housing for all our people, ensuring an inclusive and equitable society in which prosperity is enjoyed by all. Building our future through the strengthening of our democratic values and respect for the rule of law. Mr. President, Excellencies, as part of the global family, Guyana subscribes to a rule-based international order, as well as the need for resurgence of political will and commitment to protect the multilateral architecture. We are deeply concerned about the number of persons living in conflict situations. The ongoing war in Ukraine is having terrible effects on the region and country, the impact of which are disproportionately felt by women and children. We urge a speedy and peaceful resolution of the conflict and express support for the efforts of the United Nations Secretary General in this regard. In our own region, we again join the overwhelming majority of members of the international community in reiterating Guyana's rejection of the sanctions imposed on the Republic of Cuba. Guyana also restates its solidarity with the Palestinian people and its support for a dignified existence in their own homeland in accordance with a two-state solution. Guyana does not condone or support the threat of or use of force in relations between states or in the resolution of disputes. Consistent with the Charter of the United Nations, Guyana subscribes to the use of peaceful means to settle disputes. In this context, Guyana thanks those who have already expressed support for a candidature for non-permanent membership of the UN Security Council. In the matter of Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity, challenged and threatened by Venezuela as it is, we remain, to quote the Secretary General at the opening of the general debate yesterday, and I quote, committed to make the most of every diplomatic tool for the pacific settlement of dispute as set out in the Charter of the United Nations, end of quote. In this case, judicial settlement as determined by the Secretary General himself. The world's nations can be assured that Guyana shall remain true to those peaceful processes and deny every effort to depart from them. The International Court of Justice has already affirmed its jurisdiction in the matter. Mr. President, Excellencies, this Assembly must reinvigorate the spirit of multilateralism in finding solutions to the extant challenges which bedevil the global community of states. I close by reminding us all of an old quote: a hungry man is an angry man. Global inequality is linked to global security, and global security is linked to the prosperity of all of humanity. I thank you, and God bless you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. We have heard the last speaker in this meeting. The 7th plenary meeting to continue with the general debate will be held immediately following the adjournment of this meeting. This meeting is adjourned. And the 7th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will hear an address by Her Excellency Katalin Novák, President of Hungary. I request protocol to escort Her Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome Her Excellency Katalin Novák, President of Hungary, and invite her to address the Assembly.
It has perhaps always been the case that the waging of peace is the hardest form of leadership of all. I know of no single formula for success, but over the years, I have observed that some attributes of leadership are universal and are often about finding ways of encouraging people to combine their efforts, their talents, their insights, their enthusiasm, and their inspiration to work together. A quote from the speech of Her Majesty, the late Elizabeth II, from 2010, delivered here at the United Nations General Assembly. Today, on the International Day of Peace, I stand here to urge the world leaders to be faithful to the legacy of Elizabeth II so that we can live in peace. Dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm particularly pleased and honored to greet my fellow Hungarian, President Csaba Kőrösi. With his presidency, after 40 years, Hungary is again serving as President of the UN General Assembly for 1 year. It is a great honor for Hungary, and especially so in the present challenging situation. Mr. President, dear Csaba, I wish you every success in your work. I'm standing in front of you today as the President of Hungary, the first woman president of my country, wife and mother of 3 children. As a president and as a mother, I feel responsible for preserving an environment for the generations to come, in which they can enjoy security and comfort. Today, on the International Day of Peace, I stand in front of the General Assembly to reaffirm our commitment to the UN Charter, Article number 1, to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about, by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. Let us remind ourselves to the main aim why the United Nations was brought to life: peace. We, people and leaders in the Western world, often pretend that we have lived in an age of permanent peace and prosperity since the end of the Second World War. In many ways, this might be true. Indeed, we live in a more peaceful and prosperous age than before. Let's not forget, though, that the wars and armed conflicts that rage in many regions of the globe, which kill innocent people, tear apart families, destroy infrastructure and economies, turn well-kept agricultures into wasteland, and add to the destruction of the world that surrounds us. According to the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker, there are currently 27 ongoing conflicts worldwide. The tracker categorizes conflict into 3 groups: worsening, unchanging, and improving. Right now, there is not a single conflict described as improving. Globally, conflict and violence are on the rise, according to the United Nations. The UN has warned that peace is more under threat around the world than it has been since the Second World War. The number of wars and armed conflicts around the world has been rising intensively since then. The scholarly optimism that the decline in the number of casualties might lead to a process where armed conflicts become irrelevant was quickly overshadowed by recent developments in Europe and other parts of the world. Excellencies, I come from Hungary, from the heart of Europe. Everyone would assume that since the Second World War, peace has been a regional characteristic. Let us not forget that only 11 years after the end of the Second World War, Soviet tanks were rolling on the streets of Budapest. We had 45 years of communist dictatorship, and it didn't take long after the peaceful change of regime of 1989 that war broke out in our imminent southern neighborhood. The killing lasted for a decade. Now, after hardly more than 20 years, war is raging on the European continent, once again in Hungary's neighboring country. It fills us with particular concern, especially because ethnic Hungarians living across the borders also shed their blood. Russia's war against Ukraine is a constant threat and security risk, not only for the Ukrainian citizens living in the war zone, but also for all of us. The threat of escalation is a reason for worry and action. Hungary firmly condemns Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which has destroyed peace in Europe, caused dramatic human suffering and destruction, and has serious repercussions on the world order. Since the beginning of this conflict, Hungarians have stood with the victims. We have been providing economic, social, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people fleeing the war. Hungary is currently implementing the largest humanitarian operation in her recent history. The Hungarian people, churches, civil organizations, local authorities, and the government gave shelter to nearly 1 million refugees since the outbreak of the conflict. We have learned that war is evil and leads nowhere. A war only has victims, and the ones with the greatest losses are families, mothers and fathers who lose their children in the battlefield, wives who lose their husbands in the fighting, children who lose their brothers, sisters in the hell of war. It is in the strongest possible terms that we call for the investigation of war crimes committed against innocent civilians. These crimes must be documented, investigated, and prosecuted by the relevant international institutions. No crimes committed can go unpunished. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, what do we want in the UN? To win the war? We should not stand for winning any war. We need to stand for restoring the peace. If there is a will, there is a way. Hungary is a member of several federal systems. Above all, the United Nations, NATO, the European Union, the Council of Europe, and I could go on. These organizations were created by their founding fathers to pursue peace as their fundamental goal. I could say that they were created by the desire for peace, and I'm convinced that the service of peace is the foundation of their identity. Let me recall again the words of late Queen Elizabeth II. I quote, "The aims and values which inspire the United Nations Charter endure to promote international peace, security, and justice, to relieve and remove the blight of hunger, poverty, and disease, and to protect the rights and liberties of every citizen." Hungary urges fellow member states to declare peace as the major priority in the present conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Excellencies, dear President, ladies and gentlemen, it is by no means self-evident that today, at the time of war, energy, and food crisis, the organizations set up to avoid war and preserve peace are focusing on ideological indoctrination. This is not what is needed today. Instead, we must regain our ability to distinguish between the essential and the irrelevant, the important and the unimportant, reality and fiction. Most of us came to this assembly from London. We attended Elizabeth II's funeral together and bowed at her coffin. We bade farewell to an exceptional monarch whose life was steeped in service to peace. We owe it to the people and to her memory to make our decisions in the same spirit. Let me conclude by quoting Winston Churchill from 1953. "Those who can win a war well can rarely make a good peace. And those who could make a good peace would never have won a war. Let us make a good peace." Thank you for listening to me.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of Hungary for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort Her Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Alassane Ouattara, President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Alassane Ouattara, President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire, and I invite him to address the Assembly.
Monsieur Sabah,
Mr. Chamba Koroshi, President of the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Excellencies, heads of state and governments, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates. Mr. President, I would like to, first of all, congratulate you on being brilliantly elected to preside over the 77th session of the United Nations General Assembly. And I wish you every success as you discharge this lofty mission. I also would like to address my heartfelt congratulations to your predecessor, Mr. Abdallah Shahid, and to thank him for his outstanding leadership and the effective management of our deliberations during the previous session. Mr. President, his worthy initiatives in a difficult context marked in particular by the COVID-19 pandemic enabled us to keep hope for a better future. I would like to pay a very warm tribute to Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, and assure him that he has the full support of my country as he continues with his tireless efforts to strengthen the role played by the United Nations in implementing the objectives we had set for ourselves. Secretary General, you have every encouragement from us, in particular, as you implement the relevant proposals contained in your report called Our Common Agenda. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Côte d'Ivoire welcomes the major successes that we have seen in many areas of the United Nations since its inception. And in this framework, my country would like to thank the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHRC. They declared on the 30th June 2022 the end of the Ivorian refugee status. I take this opportunity to welcome the excellent cooperation we've had between the HCR and my country. Nonetheless, the growing number and the complexity of challenges we're facing in the area of peace and security, democracy, human rights, environmental protection remain sources of concern. And I welcome the relevance of the theme of the current session as it invites us to search for the solutions to the challenges we're facing. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the growing geopolitical tensions and new and emerging international conflicts undermine international peace and security. The war in Ukraine has just recalled for us the fact that peace is a permanent quest and that we have continued pursuing it tirelessly. This confrontation, with the risk that it represents of using nuclear weapons, continues to undermine global peace and to plunge humankind into various crises. It shows us yet once again the limits of military options in the settlement of conflicts. And that is why Côte d'Ivoire has always advocated peaceful coexistence as well as dialogue in the search for solutions to differences amongst nations. And we would like to renew our appeal to the immediate and definitive cessation of hostilities in Ukraine. This war has very serious economic, financial, and social ramifications for African countries. Indeed, the hike in the price of oil and the difficulties in supplying markets with grain and fertilizer have led to a generalized inflation and a spike in the interest rates in international markets, and also resulted in the slowing down of the global rate of growth. Therefore, for several African countries, this conflict means that it's difficult to fund their economies. It also means that there is a growth in the price of basic goods, and even there are cases of famine. And this is because the countries depend on the grain and fertilizer coming from Ukraine and Russia. And this situation led the government of my country, Côte d'Ivoire, to subsidize the price of oil and wheat and to cap temporarily the price of several major food products, so as to extend support to households, in particular the most vulnerable ones. I welcome the signing in Istanbul on the 22nd of July 2022 under the aegis of the United Nations and Turkey on the wheat agreement. We regret, however, that only 17% of wheat exported by Ukraine since that date have been earmarked for African countries. Now, given this fact, Côte d'Ivoire is asking once again that priority be given to Africa in the implementation of the Istanbul Agreement. Furthermore, we launch an urgent appeal to international financial institutions and to Africa's development partners to mobilize the resources necessary to support the most fragile countries so they can face the multiple ramifications of the conflict in Ukraine. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, peacekeeping operations of the United Nations are a tangible manifestation of our collective action for peace in those countries which are victims of conflict. Côte d'Ivoire hosted one of the largest peacekeeping operations in Africa, and we understand very well the sacrifice made by the troop contributing countries, the sacrifice they make so as to bring back peace and facilitate post-conflict recovery. It is because of this success of the United Nations operation in Côte d'Ivoire, UNOSI, and because of our faith in the values of the United Nations Charter, that my country decided to actively participate in United Nations peacekeeping operations as I declared to the Security Council in December 2018. I therefore am very happy with the participation of Côte d'Ivoire in the United Nations multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali, MINUSMA, and in the United Nations mission in the Central African Republic, MINURCA. And I would like to laud the professionalism of the Ivorian contingents deployed in the course of these operations. And I bow in front of the memory of the Ivorian servicemen who died in the cause of peace in the brotherly country of Mali, which needs the engagement and commitment of everyone with them as they combat armed terrorist groups. Unfortunately, in this context of fighting against terrorism, 46 Ivorian soldiers deployed within the 8th National Support Element Detachment within MINUSMA in Mali are unjustly detained there and have been detained since the 10th of July of this year. And once again, I call for their release without delay. My country encourages the Malian authorities to focus their efforts on combating terrorism and on implementing resolutely the various stages of the transition timetable, as well as institutional and political reforms in the run-up to the presidential elections planned for February 2024, and to do this for the well-being of the entire Malian people. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, terrorism continues presenting a major threat to international peace and security, and an enormous challenge that no country can face on its own. And that is why we need to strengthen our collective instruments of combating this scourge and to show our solidarity and determination. In this regard, my country welcomes the decisive action by France and its European partners in the Sahel, and reiterates its appeal for a greater involvement of other major powers in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel and in the Gulf of Guinea, in support of national armies to the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the Accra Initiative, of course. So as to contribute to this collective effort, Côte d'Ivoire puts at the disposal of the African countries its International Academy on Combating Terrorism, which is an institution in the coastal city of Jacquesville, which provides training in all civilian and military skills needed to fight against terrorism. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our session is taking place at the time where the energy crisis following the war in Ukraine tends to undermine the accomplishments we have made in greenhouse gas emission reduction, in particular because of going back in some industrialized countries to using carbon-based fuel. The time, unfortunately, is running out, and we have to act fast and implement all of the commitments contained in the Paris Agreement if we want to implement the objective of stemming the global warming below the threshold level of 1.5 degrees Celsius. To reach this goal, developed countries have to drastically reduce their levels of greenhouse gas emissions and to honor the commitment to mobilize $100 billion per year for the benefit of developing countries. COP27 to take place in Egypt will provide us, I am certain, with a new opportunity to renew the political commitment of all of the stakeholders to contribute towards the fight against global warming. I would like to state yet once again that my country will honor its commitments undertaken within the Paris Agreement on Climate, and we intend to work to protect our forest cover and our rich biodiversity. This is the rationale behind the Abidjan Legacy Program, which was launched at the 15th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Desertification, COP15, which we had the honor of hosting from 9th to the 20th of May of 2022. And I am very happy to see the exceptional mobilization and the financial support from our developing partners to the Abidjan Legacy Program, which very quickly collected the resources needed for its implementation, namely $2.5 billion. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today, more than ever, humankind is at a watershed moment for its future. The threats our countries are facing compel us to show greater solidarity, working together, justice and equity, all principles which undergird the multilateralism which my country holds dear. And it is in this spirit that Côte d'Ivoire calls for an in-depth reform of the United Nations Security Council, where Africa could find its right place. I thank you, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Your Excellency Chaba Korosi, President of the General Assembly, Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me commend the President of the 76th session of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Abdullah Shahid, for his sustained effort in returning the General Assembly to its pre-pandemic work pace and his message of hope. Let me also extend my congratulations to Your Excellency, Mr. Chaba Korosi, on your assumption of the presidency of the General Assembly. I'm gratefully optimistic about your leadership in these unprecedented times. I also commend the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for galvanizing the necessary multilateral support in search of solutions to meet the scale and urgency of current global challenges. His timely submission of our Common Agenda report that speaks to strengthening the global governance with a focus on a future agenda driven by multilateral solidarity and collective action is also commendable. As our world wrestles with an unprecedented and volatile economic outlook because of the lingering effects of COVID-19 pandemic and other crises, the theme, watershed moment, transformative solutions to interlocking challenges, is most appropriate and timely. Mr. President, our progress towards achieving global sustainable development goals by 2030 has been complicated by the repurposing of global development and investment finance, disruptions of production and supply chains, growing food and energy insecurities, general slowdowns in the economies of nations, and the perennial adverse effects of climate change. I call on the global family to be intentional and fair about developing innovative development financing products that are free from the stringent restrictions and high transaction costs associated with concessionary loans. Multilateral financial institutions can de-risk investment that are critical for sustainable development. Aid must also be aligned with domestic development priorities. Mr. President, the adverse effects of climate change are borderless. Global warming, unpredictable weather patterns, rising sea levels, and land degradation are taking a profound toll on global food and water security. There are associated governance and stability costs. We are informed that Africa faces disproportionate risk and cost from climate change. We must therefore be consistent in meeting our commitments to all existing international frameworks for addressing climate change. Beyond the usual declarations, we must collaborate on and coordinate mitigation efforts, improve infrastructure for early warning systems, invest more in improving the management of water resources, promote disaster risk management, and enhance the conservation and protection of natural habitats. There are opportunities, especially in Africa, and Sierra Leone in particular, for just energy and just rural agricultural transitions. Fair and accessible multilateral climate financing can catalyze the global and country-specific measures and innovation necessary to build and support sustainable climate resilience. Green investing does support sustainable development. In these efforts, the role and interest of women and young people must be central to climate investments. Sierra Leone is fully committed to concluding the Treaty on Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. The BBNJ Treaty must prioritize, among other things, conservation measures, fair and equitable sharing of monetary and non-monetary benefits, meaningful capacity development, and the transfer of marine technology. Mr. President, human capital development is a critical driver of inclusive and sustainable economic development. Sierra Leone has increased domestic financing for education, provided teaching and learning materials, improved education policies and governance. More children, more girls, including pregnant girls, poorer and rural learners, and learners with disability are now in school. But we can go beyond these access deficits. As co-chair of the High-Level Steering Committee on SDG 4 and champion of the Transforming Education Summit during this 77th session of the General Assembly, I urge concerted global efforts to address the learning crisis. We can mobilize innovative financing models, underwrite universal access, especially for girls and learners with disabilities, promote technology in education, make greater investment in foundational literacy and numeracy, address water, sanitation, and hygiene, and other infrastructural deficits, support school feeding programs, fund technical and vocational training, and finance other needs across the full spectrum of the education sector. With close cooperation among states, we are confident that we can address the learning crisis in our time. Mr. President, to address the global food crisis that is disproportionately affecting least developed countries, Sierra Leone joins the urgent call for action to escalate financing to support agriculture and irrigation, enhance food systems and nutrition for vulnerable populations, and social protection for at-risk populations. Sierra Leone also associates with call to ease global supply chains, especially for fertilizer, rice, and other agricultural commodities. Multilateral support for establishing agricultural development banks that will support private agricultural investment and agricultural value chain addition. We promote self-sufficiency and greater resilience in that sector. The COVID-19 pandemic reminds us that equity, multilateral cooperation, and a comprehensive global response are what we need to address health emergencies that have the potential to undermine global peace, security, and global development. Sierra Leone affirms its commitment to global efforts at exploring innovative and effective ways to enhance health security, pandemic preparedness, build capacity to respond to health emergencies, and enhance greater resilience in health care delivery. Sierra Leone believes that multilateral support is urgently needed to complement national efforts at reducing maternal and child mortality, preventing epidemics, tackling tropical and communicable diseases, building healthcare infrastructure and the capacity of healthcare personnel, and strengthening primary healthcare. Efforts at increasing domestic financing of healthcare should be supported with increased multilateral financing and enhanced cooperation. Sierra Leone remains exclusively committed to the global agenda for putting women and girls at the center of inclusive sustainable development. We believe that we cannot deliver on the 2020 Agenda on Sustainable Development without the achievement of great gender equality and women's empowerment. We must therefore garner multilateral support to achieve and sustain gender equality and the empowerment of women in our lifetime. Mr. President, Excellencies, sexual violence is a grave threat to justice and the fundamental rights of men, women, and children throughout the world. In every corner of the globe, sexual assault survivors are inhibited in holding perpetrators accountable and accessing empowering health, legal, and economic remedies. In Sierra Leone, we have taken extensive legislative and administrative actions to address sexual and gender-based violence since my declaration of rape as a national emergency in 2019. Last year, before this August assembly, I announced that I had directed a permanent mission of Sierra Leone to the United Nations to sponsor a standalone resolution on access to justice for survivors of sexual violence at the General Assembly. I called for global solidarity on this issue and for the United Nations to give all survivors of sexual violence the remedy they deserve. The General Assembly on the 2nd of September this year adopted by consensus the landmark resolution entitled International Cooperation for Access to Justice, Remedies, and Assistance for Survivors of Sexual Violence. Thank you, the National Assembly. The General Assembly has therefore affirmed the sincere and shared belief of the global community that sexual violence is condemnable and that member states must take effective actions to address it, as well as provide access to timely and unimpeded justice through national legislation for victims and survivors. As a global community, we have signaled our resolve to address this scourge. We must now do all we can to implement access to justice and other remedies to ensure dignity for all survivors and sexual violence. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, small states make up the majority of member states of the United Nations, and they are the strongest advocates of the rule-based international system that underpins the work of the United Nations. Indeed, small states have served as key drafters, negotiators, and thought leaders on a variety of international issues. They have done so diligently through transparency of purpose and coalition building across board. In that connection, Sierra Leone proposes to further pursue these values in the United Nations Security Council. I count on the invaluable and resounding support of this body for Sierra Leone's bid for a non-permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council for the term 2024-2025, with elections to be held in June 2023. Mr. President, my government reaffirms its commitment to the relevant UN chapter provisions and the declaration of the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples as contained in the General Assembly Resolution 1514. We join the call on all parties engaged in the dialogue on decolonization to continue to demonstrate good faith and firm commitment to a conclusive and durable resolution of all sovereign disputes. As the coordinator of the African Union Committee of 10 on the reform of the Security Council, I'm pleased to note the commendable progress that has been achieved in the intergovernmental negotiations on the reform of the Security Council. We believe that progress made during the 76th section of the General Assembly is underpinned by the Assembly's acknowledgement of the wider recognition and the broader support by member states for the legitimate aspiration of African countries to play their rightful role on the global stage. As Africa continues to advocate and canvass support for the common African position, as espoused in the Erzowini Consensus and the SAD Declaration, I urge member states to continue to demonstrate their renewed commitment and political will towards correcting historical injustice done to Africa by supporting the reform of the Security Council to make it a more inclusive, democratic, transparent, accountable, legitimate, and efficient global organ that properly reflects and adequately addresses the geopolitical realities of our present and future world. Sierra Leone is committed to engaging constructively within the multilateral rules-based order of the United Nations. Only through global cooperation can we engender and implement transformative solutions to global challenges. Thank you for your attention.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Alar Karis, President of the Republic of Estonia. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Alar Karis, President of the Republic of Estonia, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to be here today, though I wish where circumstances surrounding my first address were different. A year ago, Mr. Secretary General presented this inspiring report, Our Common Agenda, outlining his vision for the next 25 years of global cooperation, and initiated discussions of how to reinvigorate multilateralism and achieve sustainable development goals. I support the goals of the report, and yet it's a Herculean task because the world is torn apart. We witness the constant brutal violation of the core principles of the UN Charter on every continent. United Nations itself has become a battlefield where some states try to convince the world that the common values we all are obliged to adhere do not exist. The only standard we must follow is the UN Charter, our unique common promise of peace for all nations, large and small, a promise of advancing fundamental human rights, the equal rights of men and women. It is not a choice. It is a collective responsibility to ensure that peace, justice, and human rights prevail. On 24 February, the Russian Federation, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, attacked the democratic and peaceful sovereign Ukraine. Russia started a war of aggression with a goal to end the sovereignty of its neighbor, overthrow its legitimate government, exterminate Ukrainian nation, and implement its abusive order, impregnated of imperialism, self-interest, and dominance. Russian invasion, including the illegal occupation of Crimea and Russia prior land grabs in Georgia and Moldova, demonstrate Russia's total disrespect of international law, the rules-based international order, and as an assault of a UN Charter, every value and principle the United Nations stands for. This brutal and unjustified aggression is the most serious threat to the global peace and security since the end of the Second World War, and challenges the very foundation of UN system, undermining the security of all members of the international community. Some colleagues are hesitant to take sides vis-à-vis Russian aggression. Some argue that this war is between Russia and Ukraine. I see the aggressor and the victim. Legally, as well as morally, there is only one right side to take. Standing in a gray zone encourages the aggressor, undermines this organization, and fuels human suffering. In recent years, we have witnessed devastating human suffering in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Yemen, Syria, Sahel, and the Horn of Africa, just to name a few. The war aggression of Russia makes finding solutions to these conflicts only more difficult, as it has increased food insecurity, adds stress on the global humanitarian relief system, and bolsters economic crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, I visited Ukraine 2 months after the invasion began. The sight was horrific. I lack words to describe the brutality of this scene. The face of war is the same everywhere. Its cruelty will never leave the people who must live through this. Wars and conflicts only bring horror and misery to mankind. As of August 22nd, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded in Ukraine over 13,000 civilian casualties, with approximately 6,000 killed and nearly 8,000 injured. The actual numbers are significantly higher. Each murder is another evidence of the grave violations of international law by the aggressor. In the strongest terms, we condemn the war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. UN Assistant Secretary General of Human Rights reported to the Security Council about credible allegations of forced transfers of unaccompanied children to Russian-occupied territory or to the Russian Federation. We have seen mass graves of tortured civilians. I wonder, are we living in the 21st century? Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I want to pay tribute to the immeasurable resilience of the people of Ukraine. We grieve for the victims of Russia's aggression and stand with Ukraine in ensuring the future of its people and nation. This brave nation is fighting for values set in the UN Charter, the noble cause of freedom, democracy, and human rights. According to the UN Charter, Article 51, helping Ukraine to protect its right to exist is our collective obligation. At the same time, it is disturbing that the United Nations Security Council, a body that bears the chief responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, has been paralyzed and utterly unable to play its role. Russia has abused its veto power to block the Council from adopting any decisions regarding the grave violation of sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. The Security Council lies in the heart of the UN. It is shameful that since February 24, it has adopted only one statement on Ukraine. How many devastating wars will it take to move forward the long overdue Security Council reform? I am grateful that while the Security Council remains paralyzed on Russia's aggression issue, the soul and the conscience of the UN, the General Assembly, has been active and decisive. I recall the overwhelming support for the UN General Assembly resolution on March 2nd that condemned Russia's aggression and urged Russia to immediately and unconditionally withdraw all of its troops from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We deplore the Russian Federation's failure to implement this resolution, as well as its failure to comply with its legally binding order by the International Court of Justice on the 16th March of 2020, requiring Russia to immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine. Estonia has always been a strong proponent of curbing the absolute veto power, and even more so when it has been used to cover war crimes and crimes against humanity. I am glad that General Assembly adopted by consensus a landmark resolution, the so-called veto initiative, which provides the UN General Assembly an opportunity to step in when the UN Security Council is unable to act. The question remains, how can we accept the aggressor has a veto power in the Security Council? Excellencies, conflicts and war bring enormous humanitarian crises. Russia's aggression has led to an immense need of resources and aid. Nearly 18 million Ukrainians, 40% of the country's population, are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. The international support for Ukraine has been heartwarming. The UN is busy helping Ukrainians who didn't need our help before this aggression. To date, Estonia has sent over 20 million euros in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. We have seen an unprecedented massive support of Ukraine from the Estonian private sector, civil society, and citizens. We continue to assist and work on the reconstruction of Ukraine. It needs to begin already now. We call others to join us in this. Conflicts created immense refugee crisis. According to the UN Refugee Agency, the total number of people worldwide who were forced to flee their homes due to conflicts and human rights violations was 89.3 million in 2021. The displacements were driven, for example, by the brutality of Bashar al-Assad regime, conflicts in the Tigray region, and the Taliban's takeover of Kabul. In 2022, this number has already exceeded the milestone of 100 million. Increase is caused by Russia's war of aggression. There are more than 7 million recorded Ukrainian refugees across Europe. Another 7 million have been internally displaced. Estonia has received nearly 55,000 refugees, 4% of our country's population. We ensure social services and basic education to refugees fleeing from war. Estonia has created 1,000 additional places in different education programs for Ukrainian refugee children by opening a new school, the Freedom School. One day its students will be the leaders and rebuilders of Ukraine. Estonian education technology companies are donating their solutions to support Ukrainian schools and pupils whose education has been disrupted by war. Why I'm telling all this? Because our future depends on the youth sitting in the classrooms and on their education. We are made by history. We cannot let the lack of knowledge to define our future. To avoid such a brutality repeat itself, we have to raise awareness of the history of our nations. We need to evade confusions caused by active brainwash and disinformation. We see how ignorance makes it easy for any aggressor to put forward its false narratives. War and conflict, lack of openness bring along extreme violations of human rights. It must be clear that basic human rights are universal, same for all UN members, and cannot be ignored by any government. Special attention should be devoted to ensuring gender equality and right to education. Opportunity to study should not be a wish or a dream at the 21st century. Let me use this tribune to praise the courageous women who have now become the forefront of protest against the Taliban in Afghanistan, to fight for the right to choose their own path and role in the society. It is our profound duty to support the struggle. I call on de facto leaders of Afghanistan to immediately stop harassing the UNAMA Afghan female staff. Respecting universal human rights is not a choice. Neither culture nor religion can be invoked by justify human rights violations. In the same vein, we welcome the release of assessment report of human rights situation in Xinjiang by Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The report underscores the serious human rights violations occurring in Xinjiang, which may constitute international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. This is extremely alarming and requires urgent attention by the international community. Ladies and gentlemen, there remains little dispute over the existential crisis posed by climate change. We witnessed devastating flooding in Pakistan caused by erratic monsoon rains. In solidarity with the people of Pakistan, Estonia provides help to those severely affected. Russia's aggression also brings further pain to those already suffering from the impact of pandemic, conflicts, famine, and climate change. Let me be very clear. This aggression has brought high inflation, global food and energy crisis. The head of the UN World Food Programme has warned that Russia's aggression will lead to the worst food crisis since the Second World War. This physics and in life, the cause triggers a reaction. Russia's aggression triggered the global food and inflation crisis. We have witnessed Russia's occupying forces stealing Ukraine's grain supplies, burning down warehouses and destroying grain fields. Market disruptions are not caused by sanctions. Global food or economic crises are caused by the war Russia started, and Russia can end all this by ending the war. Yet, Russia has no intention to end the war. Instead, Russian regime decided to escalate. We find it cynical, nuclear threat totally unacceptable. It is a threat to global community. To alleviate this crisis, the EU has launched the EU-Ukraine Solidarity Lanes initiative. It has helped to export over 6 million tons of predominantly agricultural goods from Ukraine. Estonia also welcomes the Black Sea Grain Initiative that was signed in Istanbul on 22nd of July, brokered by the UN Secretary General and President of Turkey. We must keep the international pressure on Russia to monitor Russia's adherence to the deal and its extension. Excellencies, to follow with deep concern the situation is one of the world's largest Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Russia has occupied the plant and turned it into a combat zone. The risk of a nuclear disaster is very real. This power plant should be demilitarized without delay and full control of the plant returned to Ukraine. Moreover, it is essential to grant international experts a persistent and unfettered access to the facilities of power plant. I regret that last month, Russia also shamelessly blocked the consensus concerning the outcome document of a review conference of a treaty of non-proliferation. Estonia has been vocal in addressing the issue of cybersecurity in the UN. We continue these efforts to elevate cybersecurity as an essential component of the UN's international peace and security agenda. Russia has demonstrated how state-provided malicious cyber tools are used alongside conventional weapons. Russia's cyber attack against the satellite communications of Ukraine on 23rd of February served to prepare and facilitate Russia's on-the-ground invasion. Excellencies, it is our duty to ensure accountability and justice to all levels. Impunity breeds impunity and leads to the new crimes to be committed. It is the utmost importance that there are independent and effective investigations into the atrocity crimes and crimes of aggression committed against Ukraine, also in Syria, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. We must provide justice to victims and bring those responsible for atrocities and genocide to trial. Estonia fully supports the investigation led by the International Criminal Court. We give most serious consideration to the establishment of an independent special court for the crimes of aggression and the compensation mechanism for the damages caused by the aggression. We support all initiatives attempting to secure accountability. To conclude, the war in Ukraine affects us all. It is our common duty to push back the ugly manifestations of imperialism, colonialism, and racism of Russia. Russia must understand that the road they have taken is disastrous, and the war they have started cannot be won. If we stop caring, if we get tired, if we fall into indifference, the aggressors and criminals will only be empowered. This is not the world where we want to live, nor the world we want to leave to the future generations. The United Nations is and remains the cornerstone of our multilateral, rules-based world order. It is relevant to put to the rest we cannot fail. The UN must emerge from this watershed moment stronger, more united, and more relevant than ever before. Thank you for your attention.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Estonia for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. And now the Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, President of the Republic of Ghana. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, President of the Republic of Ghana, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I congratulate you on your election to lead us through this 77th gathering of the General Assembly of the United Nations. I wish you the best of luck as you take on this onerous task at this most difficult period of the world. Mr. President, as we would say in Ghana, our world is currently not in a good place. The World Bank observed last Thursday that the global economy was enduring its steepest slowdown since 1970. 2 years ago, our world came to a thundering halt as we cowered from a health pandemic, from an unknown malicious virus, coupled with a devastating global economic pandemic. High budget deficits were no longer concerns of only developing nations. By 2021, COVID-19 had pushed Africa into the worst recession for half a century. A slump in productivity and revenues, increased pressures on spending, and spiraling public debts confronted us without relent. As we grappled with these economic challenges, Russia's invasion of Ukraine burst upon us, aggravating an already difficult situation. It is not just the dismay that we feel at seeing such deliberate devastation of cities and towns in Europe in the year 2022. We're feeling this war directly in our lives in Africa. Every bullet, every bomb, every shell that hits a target in Ukraine hits our pockets and our economies in Africa. The economic turmoil is global, with inflation as the #1 enemy this year. It hit a 40-year high in the United States and United Kingdom in recent months. There's record inflation in the Eurozone. Several African countries have inflation rates surging 3 to 4 times higher than what they were just 2 years ago. In Ghana, we're experiencing the highest inflation for 21 years. The high costs of food are hurting the poor, especially the urban poor, the most. Moreover, the spillover from central banks raising interest rates to combat inflation has been severe beyond borders, as global investors pull money out of developing economies to invest in bonds in the developed world. This has led to depreciating currencies and increased borrowing costs, meaning we need to raise and spend more of our own currencies to service our foreign debts in US dollars. It has become clear, if ever there was any doubt, that the international financial structure is skewed significantly against developing and emerging economies like Ghana. The avenues that are open to powerful nations to enable them take measures that would ease pressures on their economies are closed to small nations. To make matters worse, credit rating agencies have been quick to downgrade economies in Africa, making it harder to service our debts. The tag of Africa as an investment risk is little more than, in substance, a self-fulfilling prophecy created by the prejudice of the international money market, which denies us access to cheaper borrowing, pushing us deeper into debts. The financial markets have been set up and operate on rules designed for the benefit of rich and powerful nations. And during times of crisis, the facade of international cooperation under which they purport to operate disappears. These are the savage lessons that we have had to take in as the world emerged from the grip of the coronavirus to energy and food price hikes and the world rise in the cost of living. The necessity for reform of the system is compelling. Mr. President, I'm a modest student of history, and I would say it is doubtful that any generation of inhabitants of this earth has ever witnessed such a perfect storm of global economic chaos, a war with global consequences, and an unwillingness or inability to find a consensus to deal with the catastrophe. It is under such circumstances that we have gathered under the theme, a watershed moment, transformative solutions to interlocking challenges. Excuse me. The problems we face are indeed many and vary in level of importance depending on where you are in the global order of things. Just last year, the focus was on energy transition. This year, it is about energy security, as Europe goes back to burning coal to replace Russian gas. Nevertheless, we do not have the luxury of being able to pick and choose which problem to solve. None of them can wait. The economic turbulence requires urgent and immediate solution. The turmoil and insecurity in many parts of the world require urgent attention. And so does the need to tackle the problems posed by climate change. A watershed moment indeed, it is. And history will judge us harshly if we do not seize the opportunity to make the changes that will enable us to deal with the many problems we face. Mr. President, a case in point is the destabilizing conflict in the Sahel. It might look to many today as a local conflict which affects only that region. We in Ghana know differently. We have watched in horror as the unrest has moved from the Sahel inexorably to the West African coastal countries. All of Ghana's neighbors have suffered terrorist attacks, and some have lost territorial space to the invading forces. Furthermore, the terrorist pressure has provided a pretext for the unhappy reappearance of military rule in 3 of the 15-member ECOWAS community, 2 of whom have borne the brunt of the terrorist outrages in the region, Mali and Burkina Faso. It is a development we're determined to reverse so that the ECOWAS space remains a democratic one. All of us in the region are being forced to spend huge amounts of money on security. This is money we should be spending on educating and giving skills to our young people, on building much needed roads, bridges, hospitals, and other such infrastructure, which we are spending to fight terrorists or to keep them out from destabilizing our countries. This is a global deserving the attention of the world community for a global solution. Mr. President, I'm contributing to this debate on a date that has special significance for us in Ghana. 21st September is the date we mark the birth of our first president, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. He would have been 113 years old today, and it is worth recalling on this day the driving force of his political career, which was to contribute to the birth of a united Africa, that is, the United States of Africa. We recognize today more than ever before the importance of the strength and unity of Africa, and we are working to shed that image of a helpless, hapless continent. There is a renewed commitment towards an inclusive and sustainable industrialization and economic integration. And the intensity of the challenges we face today is only matched like never before by the immensity of the opportunity before us. We, the current leaders of Africa, should be determined not to waste the crisis that confronts us. Incidentally, 2022 is billed as Africa's year to take action on food and nutrition development goals. We see the current geopolitical crisis as an opportunity to rely less on food imports from outside the continent and use better our 60% share of global share of arable lands to increase food productions. We have seen the devastating impact of relying on Russia and Ukraine for 70% of our wheat consumption. We have enough land, enough water, enough gas, and enough manpower to produce enough fertilizer, food, and energy for ourselves and for others. But we also recognize that we cannot do it all by ourselves. Our message to the global investor community is therefore this: Africa is ready for business. Africa needs you, and you need Africa. You need Africa because Africa is busily building the world's largest single market of 1.3 billion people. Soon we will have a customs union, and soon we will have a continental payment system that will accelerate and facilitate trade amongst ourselves. Already, goods and services are flowing more freely across our artificial borders. See Africa for what it is: the new frontier for manufacturing, for technology, for food production. That is why 6 years ago, I launched in Ghana the successful policy of one district, one factory, a policy with government incentives that has directly seen so far some 125 factories being set up in various districts across the country, leveraging on each area's competitive advantage. That is why 6 years ago, my government embarked on an aggressive policy of planting for food and jobs, which has helped our farmers increase their yields in folds. Indeed, we're recognizing that many of the things we import can be found or produced in Ghana or in other African countries. The African Continental Free Trade Area, whose secretariat is located in Accra, Ghana's capital, is driving intra-African trade and creating an unparalleled momentum for our continent's economic diversity and transformation. We know that industrialization is the way to go. And with the single market as the added incentive, we've taken policy measures in Ghana to add value to our natural resources. For example, we're processing more of our cocoa, refining more of our gold, and we're determined to exploit the entire value chain of our huge lithium deposits. We're busily building an integrated bauxite and aluminum industry and an integrated iron and steel industry, building new oil refineries, and have so far attracted 6 of the world's biggest automobile manufacturers to have set up assembly plants in Ghana prior to producing them in the country. In line with the African Union's Agenda 2063 and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Africa's ambition is to transform our food systems over the next decade, anchored in the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program and the Malabo Declaration on Accelerated Agricultural Growth. What we require now is support from the investor community for the rolling out of Africa's lucrative agro-industry, and for the community to see agribusiness in Africa as much more an opportunity than the perceived exaggerated risk, which has been the false but dominant narrative. In conclusion, Mr. President, on 25th July 2016, this Assembly adopted Resolution A/RES/70/293, proclaiming 2016-2025 as the third industrial development decade for Africa, with UNIDO tasked to lead it in collaboration with a range of partners. I believe it is time for the United Nations to take proper stock of this initiative and ask a few searching questions, recognizing what could have been achieved with greater commitment and focus. Working together, we can get our world back into a better and happier place. And thank you for your attention.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Ghana for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. And now the Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Jose Maria Pereira Neves, President of the Republic of Cabo Verde. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Jose Maria Pereira Neves, President of the Republic of Cabo Verde, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Excellencies, heads of state, government, and delegations, Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, dear delegates, ladies and gentlemen. The Republic of Cabo Verde encompasses the inhabitants of the 10 islands that make up the national territory located in the mid-Atlantic off the West African coast, and an immense diaspora, which is our 11th island, scattered throughout the 4 corners of the world. As President of the Republic and highest representative of this global nation, I have the enormous privilege of extending my greetings to all of you, and from the pulpit of this august assembly to bring montañas greetings in the mother tongue of Cabo Verde, from Cabo Verdeans to the peoples of the world, represented here by their highest dignitaries, auguring the best wishes for prosperity and happiness shared by all. We look forward with hope to the Summit of the Future in 2023, as foreseen in the Secretary General's proposal of our common agenda, so that it may effectively help forge a new global consensus on what our future should look like and what we can do today to secure it. With this in mind, Cape Verde reiterates before this august assembly its firm purpose of continuing to be an active and useful member of the United Nations system, acting and articulating its actions on four major fronts, from more specific to broader, to fully own up to its responsibility in the framework of national governance, to value its specificity and grow from its status as a small island state in development, to be a spokesperson in context of the diversity and the designs of Africa, the continent to which it belongs, and ultimately continue to be a champion of multilateralism for the advancement of the causes of progress and well-being of humanity. In their journey, SIDS face structural limitations such as geographical remoteness and isolation, their small economic dimension, dependence on imports, and high costs on the one hand, and exports of sector concentrated services on the other, which more frequently and intensely expose them and make them vulnerable to the impact of external shocks, whether climate, economic, or of other nature, such as pandemics and geopolitical conflicts. My country, Cape Verde, for example, in the past 15 years, between 2007 and 2022, has suffered the economic and social impact of multiple crises, the economic and financial crisis of 2007-2008, at the very moment of our graduation from the list of LDCs, the COVID-19 pandemic,